Hey, the last few weeks we've been intensifying the conversation around coronavirus, global pandemic. And there are actually, I've noticed in talking to people and in social media, there are multiple different narratives which are generated about this, a lot of which cause us to feel uncertain, confused, fearful, and powerless. So I've had the great good fortune. I work as a coach, and I work with people who are. All my clients have global perspective. They're doing something forward-thinking and global. They're kind of disruptors, you could say. So over the last weeks, I've been in conversation. One of my coaching clients is quite senior in the World Health Organization. Another is, trying to say this very anonymously, a leader in forward-thinking entrepreneurship and business. So through multiple conversations, I've been able to recognize another narrative that we can develop about this. And I want to share this with you today. Quick warning, this is not going to be a quick soundbite. So some people really like their messages delivered in 30 seconds or less, or one sentence. And what I want to share with you is a little more complex and nuanced, so it will take a little while. Even if 3 people only get to the end, it's probably worth sharing because this can offer you a completely different perspective, a different dimension of seeing what's happening. So, because there are multiple different narratives, when you have any situation with multiple different narratives, each of which makes sense in its own perspective, it creates a certain reaction in your mind. So right now, one of the narratives, which some people, I guess, believe is the official authoritarian narrative put out by the government. Now, particularly in America, it's very difficult to believe everything the government is saying because it's frequently contradicted within the administration, contradicted by scientists, by reliance on facts, and so that creates a fracturing. Some people are willing to just trust our current president and administration that just they're taking care. Others have come to inherently distrust anything they say. So that's one narrative, is the one that you're being given by the official narrative given by government, which also includes more like global organizations like the World Health Organization. Many people feel distrustful of those narratives because they're concerned that there's just either there's a concern to just pacify everybody, even though this situation might be quite serious, but equally there's the concern that there may be some kind of global conspiracy to reduce the population, to control people's minds, all of which are quite plausible within that narrative. So that creates a second narrative. One is what the government and powers that be are telling you. The second is a kind of a counter narrative, which is a dark, insidious suspicion that everybody in charge is actually out to kill you or to do you harm. And this creates multiple different explanations, which starts to tie in, what's it called? Spraying, my mind's gone blank for a minute, but chemtrails. It ties in chemtrails, the possibility that many different of viruses today are man-made, human-made, including Lyme's disease, various different viruses we've been exposed to, AIDS, and so on. So but because none of this is really clearly substantiated by academic research that can be really proven, it's conjecture, and may be true, may not be true, but it creates a certain effect in your mind. Now, there's another narrative alongside this, which has also been propagated by the government, which is that you can't trust anything the media says. So consequently, anybody trying to sort out all this, like what the government's saying, what conspiracies are saying, that's like journalists, people who are trained to sort out fact from fiction. But now there's been a narrative developed that you can't trust anything the media says because they're fake news. So what does all this do? If you put all this together, it means there is really no solid place left for trustworthy, objective truth. So if we put aside which of these is more correct, some people say, oh, the Trump and his administration, they're reliable, we can trust them. Some people say, no, you can't trust them at all. These alternative exposés of conspiracy, they're more trustworthy. Some people say, no, trust the media. But ultimately, you've just got multiple different narratives. Then you've got your intuition, then you've got, channeled information, it just goes on and on. So what happens to the human mind when there are multiple different narratives happening, none of which you can trust? So in order to answer that question, I'm going to wind us back in time to the early 70s. And this was, as you know, the Summer of Love happened in 1967, Haight-Ashbury. This was the time of another time when you couldn't trust the government very well, because it was the time of the Vietnam War. And clearly the narrative being offered by the government was untrustworthy. Nixon eventually resigned, but you couldn't trust anything he was saying. So this is a very similar time when there were multiple different narratives being offered. And at that time, in the early 70s, there were a group of very intelligent people who started to explore what happens to the human mind when it's presented with multiple unreliable narratives. And this was mostly applied at that time to the individual, not so much collectively. So one of these was Gregory Bateson, who wrote a book called Towards an Ecology of Mind. Another was R.D. Laing, who wrote the book Knots, but his most famous book is the Politics of Experience. And there was also David Cooper, who wrote a book called Death of the Family. Now, all of these people were actually exploring what happens to an individual when they are presented with multiple parallel realities, each of which appears to cause you to need to do something, and you just feel stuck. And so Bateson coined this term schizoid, which later became the whole foundation of understanding schizophrenia. R.D. Laing, he developed this amazing center in London where apparently schizophrenic patients and their caregivers all live together, you could say, like in community. And the point of having schizophrenic patients and caregivers living in a way that you couldn't tell the difference between who was the caregiver and who was the patient, was it allowed people who were termed schizophrenic to recognize there might be something sane in their reaction to how they'd been conditioned. So what these people, Bateson, Laing, Cooper, what they were exploring was what happens to the mind when it's presented with multiple undesirable narratives, so that you're in this double bind. You just like whichever narrative but you believe, you're kind of messed up and you can't completely trust it. Now this phenomenon of double bind, it has a long history, right? It goes back to my namesake Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. He was presented with a double bind. He was a Kshatriya warrior. And so in the Kurukshetra battle, he was pitted against the enemy, which was his own family, right? So Bhima, the person who raised him from a child, was on the alternative army. So now Arjuna has this tremendous pressure as a Kshatriya warrior to go to war and be noble, but in doing so, he would be killing the people he loved the most. That's a double bind. And in each reality, one reality is I'm a noble warrior. The other is I am related to these people. You can't win. It's a double bind and you can't win. And that actually resulted in Krishna delivering to Arjuna the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, the kind of ultimate teachings of liberation from mind. There's multiple expressions of this in Greek tragedy, but if you wind forward, you get to Hamlet about 400 years ago, approximately. Hamlet was also faced with an incredible double bind. And in this double bind, his father had died, but he meets the ghost of his father. And the ghost of his father says, I was actually murdered by my brother, your uncle, and you must avenge my death. So Hamlet goes, okay, so that's the reality. I've got to avenge my father's death. Great, know what to do. But the next morning, when he contemplates this, maybe this was just a fantasy in my head. Maybe this was just my mind going crazy. So now he's faced with a double bind. Which is true? Is it really true that my father was murdered and I need to avenge his death? Or is it really true that I'm crazy and I've got to stop listening to these thoughts? And that gives rise to one of the most famous quotes in English literature: to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler to suffer the sling, whether 'tis, oh gosh, hang on, I've lost it now. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them. Thank God I could remember. So this is a double bind. Do I take action based on what I've seen, or do I feel what I'm feeling and realize it's unreliable? And that puts him into a schizoid state. So basically Hamlet goes schizophrenic 400 years before anyone knew what schizophrenia was, until he's actually called upon to action in his sea trip with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and he transcends this impossible split in his mind, and then he knows what to do. So Bateson, Lang, and Cooper, they explored how this happens individually. Back in the early 70s, they explored what happens to a mind when it's faced with impossible choices. And Bateson, in his book Towards an Ecology of Mind, he recognized that there are really two outcomes of a double bind. One is that you become split. Unable to act, you become caught in an unbearable suffering of being split between alternative realities. In a mild state, that of course causes anxiety and depression, and what he called schizoid, that you're caught between multiple outcomes, each of which is undesirable. But he also described the possibility of evolving, that you transcend this split and you evolve into a higher expression of yourself. And you can see that happen with Hamlet, certainly happened with Arjuna, and Bateson was suggesting that this was the potential gift of schizoid states. Now, all of that was really vibrant and alive, this conversation in the early 70s, but we kind of moved on from the breakdown. With the resolution of the crisis around the Vietnam War, we moved on. We moved into the late 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, where it was back to business as usual. The 90s was one of the biggest boom times of making money, getting famous, get your book on the New York Times bestseller. Then there was the internet, influenced loads of people. So we got back into a collective mindset of success, success, success. And really this interest in transcending this kind of split, which is fairly intrinsic to human predicament, really got pushed underground. Back in the early 70s, though, that whole conversation, it gave rise to an interest in what we called human potential. So people started to learn to meditate, because when you meditate, you learn to watch these conflicting forces, to see mind, and then to transcend that into two things. One is a much more vivid experience of the present moment, like, wow, cup of tea, and the smell of the flowers, and breathing. So a more vivid experience of the present moment, which transcends double bind, but also a recognition of the nature of consciousness itself, to realize that you are ultimately something beyond this whole dualistic experience. You are something like pure consciousness, which is intrinsically joyful. So while all of this was being developed, it gave rise to the impetus to evolve and to grow. And that really was another strong force that took off in the late 60s, early 70s, and became human potential. So we might be seeing, one way to see what's occurring now is we might be seeing a duplication of what Bateson and Lang and Cooper recognized in the early 70s, but now happening collectively. Collectively, one way to see this is when you've got multiple narratives, none of which can be trusted, either as collectively we're going to implode and kind of go crazy, or we're going to transcend into another way of living, which is based in different principles. It's not so based in narratives. It's based in what is true in this moment. What can I experience in this moment? How can I have real, authentic, loving connections with other people, which are just in this moment, free of story, free of history? How can I experience my true nature as free? You're only going to have the incentive to discover any of that when you are in a state of breakdown. So, for example, Eckhart Tolle, he didn't just wake up because he was having a great time making money on the stock market. He woke up because he was at the point of suicidal despair. He was ready to kill himself when he had this thought, I can't live with myself anymore. And then he asked himself, wait, who can't live with who? And that catapulted his attention back into recognizing himself as intrinsically free. Byron Katie also woke up in a halfway house. She wasn't having a great time doing real estate deals. She had come to the end of the road of her sanity. Now, just supposing if what's happening now globally, which is very confusing, it's very confusing to know who to listen to, and everything we're used to is getting disrupted. We can understand logically, oh, we need to quarantine, we need to keep social distance. We can understand all that rationally, but a lot of intelligent people are asking, wait a minute, is that all that's going on here, or is there something else? And there's little signs that cause people to question the narrative. Not to necessarily come up with clear answers. When we try and come up with clear answers, we develop conspiracy theories, which are often a little unthought through. But simply to question is enough. If you just question, like, wait, what is actually going on? It may become, the bright side of this may become that it's an incentive for evolution, an incentive to catapult ourselves into what we have always, for thousands of years, intuitively known was our potential. That's why we revere people like Jesus, Buddha, Huan Yin, and in modern times, Eckhart Tolle, Byron Katie, Jack Cornfield. That's why we revere people who demonstrate a capacity to be present, to not get so caught in narrative, to enjoy the present moment, to be loving because it's an expression of your true nature, not an expression of manipulation or gaining influence. This whole setup today, disturbing as it may be to the socio-economic machine, disturbing as it may be to the comfort of life and as usual, it may be the very fertile soil that we need for a collective leap into another way of living. So, in summary, then, how if we're going to be experiencing more quarantining, if you and I are going to be facing less business as usual, more time to be with ourselves, one way we could use that is massive amounts of social media, blah, 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 trying to figure out what's the true narrative, which will actually just drive you more and more crazy, because how can you prove ultimately which is the true narrative? The other way that we could use this time is to take a stand for sanity. Maybe not all the time, but as much as possible, to take time to inquire more deeply. Where is that deeper place in me which is beyond out of control thinking and reactive feeling? What is the possibility of a real connection with another human being, which is based in authentic, honest communication about what's true in this moment? And what is there about this moment now that I can enjoy and be grateful for, even if this is my last 5 minutes, even if the whole future is very unstable and unknown? What is there about right now? Look at this, it's a fountain pen with a gold nib that writes with ink. Wow, what a wonderful thing that is to experience while alive. Random example. These are some of the ways that we could take this time counterintuitively, instead of buying into more and more panic and trying to hold on to some certainty, to actually let go and relax into uncertainty. It's counterintuitive because it's not the way that the mind deals with emergency. But it can, if enough people, if enough of us connect in that, I don't know what's happening next, I don't even know what's happening now, but there is a beauty to this moment. That sanity, that presence, can actually create a new conversation, which is not so much about what's true or untrue, but which is actually about what is here, what is reliable. Thank you so much for listening to a long conversation today. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please add your comments.